Thank you, Daniel. Thank you all for joining me. Thank you, Torrin Gatson, for suggesting I apply to this program. And thank you, Brad Rauschenberg, for taking many of these wonderful photos. My father's side of the family has lived on the tidewaters of the Chesapeake Bay for centuries, beginning when Europeans first colonized the marshes, peninsulas, and sandbars of what would be named Maryland and Virginia. My father and stepmother currently live on the eastern shore of Virginia, in Onancock, about a 40-minute drive from Cherry Grove, the original site of the room I'll discuss today. The eastern shore holds a huge amount of emotional and spiritual power in my life. I'm still figuring out exactly why. When I spend time there, the place evokes in me an uncanny sense of being at home, though I grew up far away. But what is this evocational tide, and how did it get inside of me? My focus this month has been the parlor of Cherry Grove. Rather than telescoping in on one moment in the 18th century, I'm zooming out. I see the parlor of Cherry Grove not as a room whose period of significance is the finger snap of 1760, but instead as an artistic collaboration spanning 2.5 centuries. The Cherrystone Inlet is a place now famous for its clams, which are indeed delicious. Cherry Grove was built on a parcel of 1,000 acres. Debedevan, the laughing king of the Accomack people, gave the land, at least by European accounts, to Thomas Savage in the 1600s. 5 generations later, Nathaniel Littleton Savage, a prosperous and prominent man, paid for the house to be built. It was likely finished in 1760. Today, the area is called Savage Neck. It was a gambrel roof, 1.5-storied house with a parlor, hall passage, and unusual doors for Virginia. Savage was a man concerned with business and appearances, as per his tempestuous letters. After having 3 children and living in the house for 7 years, Savage moved to York County. A prosperous ferryman bought the house, William Burton. The Eastern Shore isn't so big a place, and he ended up marrying back into the same Savage family. So the house and the land returned to Savage hands. The men who owned the land were traders and planters. As of 1770, Burton enslaved 71 people. As of 1805, Savage enslaved 79. This probate document from William Burton lists enslaved people's names in alphabetical order. Many of them were likely the same people who appear in Savage's will, too. The Savage family lived in the house until the 1830s. The 1,000 acres was divided and sold to various people after this, and in 1849, the place where Cherry Grove sits was sold to the Westcote family, who lived there until at least the Great Hurricane, called the Storm King of 1933, which brought terrible flooding and 90-mile-per-hour winds to the eastern shore. It seems the house was damaged in 33, though some accounts say people lived in the house until at least 1944. For my purposes, it is worth noting that Storm King is also a very important art center in New York. We are in the art world. Perhaps the damage wasn't structural, or perhaps water in the house was not a particularly shocking event, since it is so close to the shore. At some point in the house's history, people were moved to mark the building with their artistic response to this watery environment. Someone added decorative elements to the carefully crafted woodwork of the walls, a fleet of boats. Carved delicately into the wall, about 2 feet above the floor, there are about a dozen boats. They sail along each panel of this wall, with one notable exception being 2 hulls on the catty corner panel. Maybe it's the shipyard. The ships float across the blue walls, etched in fine, misty lines, apparently floating inches from the floor. If invited to approach, even the most formal and erudite among us will find themselves sitting crisscross applesauce on the floor of a museum, or crawling like a cat to peer with nose inches from the wall, a moment to be intimate and delicate with an architectural skin. The double mast, gaff rigging, and large rudder suggest the style of schooners piloted by traders in the 18th and 19th centuries, good for precise movements in shallow waters like the Cherrystone Inlet. Please also note the anchor. When exactly did our muralist work? Even after the schooners were no longer the main mode of commerce or transportation, they were certainly common sights in books. Just any time in the 210 years between 1760 and 1970? Can we eliminate any periods? The stratigraphy report suggests that the dark blue paint we see here was layer number 2, the first being a sort of gray. There's not much grime between the gray and the blue, so it probably got repainted relatively quickly. The original color scheme may have been a bit old-fashioned for Mr. Burton, who moved in 7 years after the house was completed. He could have had it repainted in about 1767, which tracks for the shade of blue he may have chose. So let's shave off the first 7 years of the timeline. Another clue, the boats were scratched before the house was wired with electricity, as we can see here, where the rectangle of the outlet box has cut out and obscured most of the ship. The Eastern Shore was, and is, so far-flung that much of it didn't get electrified until the Rural Electrification Act, a program of the New Deal that was passed in 1935. This shaves off a decade or two near the end as well. So that narrows us down. They were carved between 1767 and 1935, a mere 168 years. Can the aesthetic form tell us anything? Some cuts are confident, precise, direct. Others freewheeling, energetic, spirited. Some are deep, some are shallow. This may suggest a number of things, a variety of ages and motor skills, a variety of carving tools, or perhaps a fan of Paul Klee. Were the boats carved by a hand who had seen, done business on, felt the boards creak beneath these boats, or someone in 1927 who lived in an old house and liked boats? 2 brothers with 4 years between them? The same enthusiast over multiple years? Or perhaps Grandpa Savage sat down with the illegitimate son of his daughter, etching his own meaningfulness into the wall and ensuring that his grandson would feel the same meaning, the same belief in his own significance. A big question for me is, why do the boats get to remain? How can these graffiti-style etchings stay in the public parlor of a big house? Is this an artistic moment of power? Who had the status to carve into the wall? Could it be that the people who actually maintained this house, cleaned it and dusted it, kept it safe and ship-shape for years, were enslaved people who had no ability to assert their agency in the face of the head of the house carving boats into the walls in the parlor? I only know of the muralist's work today because of MESDA. Frank L. Horton got wind of Cherry Grove in 1969 and spent months visiting and writing letters to the Westcote family, offering to buy the building, which now sat empty. While first rebuffed, Horton was eventually able to purchase it and brought a team to Virginia in 1970 to salvage what was useful. Here we see Frank in front of a Coke brand thermometer. Many who knew him recall his predilection for 6.5-ounce glass bottles of Coke. While many folks in the MESDA camp agree that this was the best choice as preservation of what mattered about Cherry Grove, some others disagree. Is the Cherry Grove parlor, in fact, a trophy of the colonial revival? Architectural skins sliced from a forlorn old house? Or what if Cherry Grove is of more use to us as a vanished house than as an intact one? What if its remains fall into contrast with a house across the Cherrystone Inlet that still stands? Behold, the grandeur that is Eyre Hall, grand with its orangery, its allée of crepe myrtles, and its huge, heavy, glossy-paged, edited by Carl Lounsbury and released in 2021 book, The Material World of Eyre Hall, 4 Centuries of Chesapeake History. This place is confident in its ability to reify its own significance. Is not the contrast of crumbled dust next to a grand home just as valuable, proving to us that saving Eyre Hall is, indeed, a difficult and worthy family task of stewardship? And nota bene, Cherry Grove is just a little to the left of this, so we almost made the cover. The audience walks through a labyrinth of the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, taking a left, 2 straights, a right, through a low door, and a left, to arrive in the Cherry Grove parlor. 4 walls are hung with wooden paneling from the original house. There are 4 windows, 9x9 panes. There is a mantelpiece. And many of these materials were brought to the Carolina Piedmont from the Cherrystone Inlet in a truck. Other structural materials were probably from the hardware store. 7 years after the salvage, and served up with cocktails and hors d'oeuvres, the rooms were open to guests. Far from the dangers of hurricanes, the quadrangles and planks of wood are now safely entombed inside a fireproof cinder block box. Here, we can see the preparation for a performance of a room inside of a museum. This arrangement of confabulated spaces and combination of replica and artifact brings to mind two other art installations that I often contemplate. Cherry Grove is one twist in the labyrinth of the greater layout of MESDA, crouched in darkness, in addition to a building that was once a 1940s Kroger. As unusual as this may sound, it attracts my attention because in nearby Greensboro, there is a contemporary art space located in a former thrift store that was formerly an Army surplus store. It's called Elsewhere. Also, in New York in 2007, I found myself in an art installation created by Mike Nelson called A Psychic Vacuum, which was a temporary maze of rooms created out of architectural salvage within the larger Essex Street Market. The art installation felt as if someone had always just exited the space until you yourself were dumped out among sand dunes punctuated with columns. And before you accuse me of free associating, I bring us to David L. Barquist's History of the Architectural Period Room, in which he argues that the first appearance of a period room in a museum comes as a response to the Philadelphia Exposition of 1876, in which essentially department store setups were manufactured in order to sell furniture. But back to the 18th century. On the back of one wall of paneling in Cherry Grove, there remains white chalk writing, some smudged, but some clear. When it was noticed in 1970, the movers were careful not to disturb it, and when the paneling was installed in MESDA, they had the wonderful impulse to highlight the chalk with frame molding and give it its own light. But what do the chalk marks say? Many of the marks seem related to the math of the building. The bottom word seems to resemble Nathaniel, which could signal that this is Nathaniel Littleton Savage's house. It could be a couple of different Nathaniels who were carpenters in Northampton County, and the top word remains an irritant. Morton, Burton. People in 1970 actually tried to figure it out too, with much the same conclusions as myself. Part of it has been reasonably read, though. The middle phrase seems to say John Evans, 1760. Terrell Lee Armistead identified a couple of 18th century carpenters who fit the bill, but I wanted some second opinions. My dad and stepmom are avid puzzlers who like to unspool mysteries. They too felt stumped about much of the writing, but one thing did ring a bell. When I mentioned John Evans and my investigations into his background, my dad said, "You remember, of course, that you are an Evans." I was shocked to realize that I had forgotten my great-grandmother's maiden name, the Evans family, who lived along the long peninsulas of the Tidewater. Great-Uncle Clark, who was a bachelor tobacco farmer who cooked fried eggs for 5 minutes until they were like leather. I haven't had the time to triple-check how I'm related to this particular John Evans, but for today, let's say I am. So the next step is, how will I add to the collaboration with an ancestor 261 years later? I plan to explore the actual place of Cherrystone Inlet in much more detail. To make things even more complicated these days, there is a replica of the gambrel roof Cherry Grove house built on the land right now as a private residence. I'm obsessed with taking photos using the green disposable cameras they still sell at the drugstore. Although these are so out of style that they're back, Urban Outfitters has them. So in some ways, I think I'm trying to remember something that never happened to me. I dream of the furniture and detritus when the house was photographed in 1970, and replacing those objects in the interior again, as it was in situ. And I dream of installing Kroger shelves in the crisscross room. I dream of writing my own tour of MESDA as Andrea Fraser wrote one of the bathrooms, water fountains, and the gift shop at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1989. I dream of sitting longer and closer with Fred Wilson's work at Old Salem, his interdisciplinary elegance that always seems intuitive, his precision, his perception, his nudges forward. I looked up the definition of a site of historical significance. The location of a significant event, a prehistoric or historic occupation or activity, or a building or structure, whether standing or ruined or vanished, where the location itself possesses historic, cultural, or archaeological value, regardless of the value of any existing structure. The materials that make up the Cherry Grove parlor seem to have interacted with all of these criteria. Perhaps it is less about how humans have acted upon the object, but how the object works upon us. It seems that this room, Frankenstein together though it is, still maintains a powerful valence, attaching us to curiosities about centuries of people and bringing me to an ultra-specific place hundreds of miles and years away. But the poignancy and power isn't just in the terroir of the Eastern Shore, but instead in the uncanny experience of sitting in a room that has found a new home. How do these walls create their own new site here in Winston-Salem? What does this room tell us about ourselves? Thank you.